Imagine being chosen as a teenage girl, ripped from your family, locked away behind golden walls, never to leave again. Your beauty is both your passport and your prison. And your only purpose? To compete for the fleeting attention of one man, the Emperor of China. Welcome back to another eye-opening episode. Today, we're diving deep into the shadowy, heartbreaking world of Chinese imperial concubines, the hidden lives behind the grandeur of the Forbidden City. If you're fascinated by history's darker corners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon to stay updated with more gripping stories from the past. Inside the Forbidden City's inner sanctums, far from the public eye, thousands of women lived secluded lives. Most of them were palace maids and attendants, but a select few were chosen for a much more intimate, high-stakes role. Concubines, whose sacred duty was to bear children for the emperor. These women were not free to roam. They were confined to the inner court, an isolated world tucked deep within the northern part of the palace. Their lives were shaped by rigid hierarchy, intense scrutiny, and constant competition. At the very top stood the empress. Beneath her were imperial consorts, concubines, and finally, the vast army of female staff and palace workers. This rigid structure was more than ceremonial. It governed every breath they took. The practice of selecting concubines dates back to the Jin dynasty, but by the Ming and Qing eras, it had evolved into an elaborate, merciless system. During the Ming dynasty, every unmarried woman, unless already married or physically unfit, was legally obligated to participate in the imperial selection process. No family, no matter how humble, was exempt. Under the Qing dynasty, things narrowed further. The selection was limited mainly to Manchu and Mongol families within the Eight Banners system. To ensure loyalty and control, Han Chinese girls were largely excluded. The process was anything but romantic. Girls would be brought by their families and local officials to the Shenwu Gate of the Forbidden City. There they would undergo an exhaustive inspection, scrutinized for body hair, skin conditions, body odor, even how they behaved while sleeping. Yes, even their sleeping habits were observed. Candidates had to share a bed with the emperor's mother to see if they snored, moved too much, or smelled unpleasant in the night. One wrong twitch could ruin their chances. Those who made it past the first round were taught how to walk, speak, sit, bow, and behave. They learned calligraphy, chess, dancing, and poetry. But in truth, they were being groomed, not for success, but for survival in a world where beauty could be a blessing or a death sentence. Only a few dozen girls made it through the final stages, and out of those, just 3 were chosen to become the emperor's top concubines. The rest, many would live their entire lives in the palace, never once meeting the man they were supposed to serve. The competition didn't end there. In fact, it only became more dangerous. Jealousy and political maneuvering were constant threats. Concubines who caught the emperor's eye became targets of envy and resentment. Their every move was monitored, not just by rivals, but by the all-seeing eunuchs who enforced the emperor's will. Before visiting the emperor's bedchamber, a concubine had to bathe, be inspected by a physician, and await a formal summons. If chosen, her name would be written in vermilion ink by a scribe, an official record of the emperor's nightly activities. These acts weren't just personal, they were matters of national importance. The emperor might have had hundreds or even thousands of concubines, and yet many women spent decades confined to their chambers, sewing, applying makeup, and waiting for a summons that might never come. This system was rooted in Confucian ideals, where managing one's household, including many wives, was seen as a marker of manhood. For the emperor, having many women wasn't just about pleasure, it was a political necessity. Securing an heir was the highest duty. Polygamy was the norm, especially among the wealthy and noble classes, yet even among many wives, one woman, the principal wife, stood above the rest. She was expected to suppress jealousy, maintain harmony, and guide the others with dignity. Love, in the romantic sense, was irrelevant. The emperor was not to favor any one woman too much. Emotions had no place in the grand machinery of empire. Every dynasty developed its own hierarchy for consorts, and every new wife received a rank that placed her precisely within the system. Her position wasn't just ceremonial, it determined her clothing, housing, servants, and even how she bowed in court. And beneath all of it, the training, the hierarchy, the beauty, lay a grim truth. These women were prisoners. Most would never leave the Forbidden City. Many died there, forgotten by history, and the glittering palace that so many outsiders admired was, for them, nothing more than a gilded cage. But then comes the big question: what happened after the emperor died? This is where the story of concubinage took an even more harrowing and less glamorous turn. Concubines were not simply women of the court or companions, they were legally and culturally regarded as the personal property of the emperor, his possessions in life, and often in death as well. In the tombs of many ancient Chinese nobles and emperors, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of several women, usually close in age and status, buried beside a single man. These findings point strongly to the grim reality that some concubines were sacrificed to accompany their lord into the afterlife. Different dynasties had different customs when it came to the fate of a deceased emperor's many concubines, but even within a single dynasty, exceptions and deviations occurred. Generally speaking, there were several possible outcomes. If the concubine's son ascended to the throne, she usually remained in the palace, enjoying increased influence and prestige. The empress would also typically stay in the palace. However, if a concubine had not borne any children, her fate ranged from deeply miserable to utterly tragic. High-ranking consorts from noble households were sometimes permitted to return home and spend the rest of their lives in peaceful seclusion, surrounded by their families, but forgotten by history. Low-level concubines, often from poor or common backgrounds, were usually not afforded such mercy. They were kept in secluded quarters within the palace, cut off from the rest of the world, and lived out the remainder of their lives in eerie silence. Some were sent to nunneries, forced to abandon their past lives and dedicate themselves to spiritual service. Others were assigned to guard the dead emperor's tomb, living in small, bare homes near the burial site, tending to the grounds and existing as eternal mourners. In some older dynasties, notably during the Chen and Qin periods, it was common for concubines who had not given birth to be executed after the emperor's death, buried alongside him as spiritual offerings. One remarkable exception to all of this was Wu Zetian, who entered the palace as a teenage concubine of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. After his death, she was sent to a Buddhist nunnery, as was customary, but fate had other plans. She began a relationship with Taizong's son, Li Ji, essentially her stepson, and after he became emperor, he brought her out of the nunnery and made her his queen. Over time, she rose to power and ultimately became the only female emperor in Chinese history, a feat that defied every societal expectation of her gender and role. Still, she was a rare anomaly. For the vast majority of concubines, life after the emperor's death remained bleak. During the Han Dynasty, the emperor's sons were often sent to rule distant territories, and their mothers were permitted to live in these lands with them. Those who had not borne children, however, were left behind to care for the imperial tomb. In some cases, concubines from previous reigns, especially those noted for their beauty, were absorbed into the harems of newly crowned emperors, effectively recycled into a system that never stopped. The Song dynasty granted some surviving concubines honorific titles and allowed them to remain in the palace for life, while others were again condemned to tomb duty or compelled to take their own lives. In the Yuan dynasty, concubines who had given birth were treated with respect and allowed to live comfortably, but those without children faced exile or silence. During the Qing dynasty, some concubines voluntarily committed suicide to demonstrate loyalty and devotion to their deceased emperor. Others, however, were given honorary titles and permitted to live out their lives quietly within the palace walls. Despite how modern portrayals might romanticize the lives of these women, reality paints a very different picture. Many concubines lived for years, sometimes decades, without stepping into direct sunlight. While tales of forbidden affairs with palace guards or eunuchs exist, they were rare because the punishment was always death. Most women weren't willing to risk brutal execution just for a fleeting taste of freedom. In fact, some desperate concubines engaged in illicit relationships solely to become pregnant and pass the child off as the emperor's in hopes of gaining status or protection. In the absence of DNA testing, this deceit was difficult to disprove, but the danger was monumental. Abortions were not an option, and once a pregnancy began to show, there was no hiding the betrayal. A child conceived without the emperor's involvement meant certain death. While life as a consort wasn't always a permanent sentence, escaping the palace was no easy feat. Women could not send or receive letters, and no doctor was allowed to enter the palace to examine a sick consort in person. Instead, their symptoms were written down, and diagnoses and prescriptions were issued through intermediaries. Some concubines did leave, but usually as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, a transfer from one gilded prison to another. Others, after many years of loyal service, were allowed to retire with modest pensions. Emperor Hongwu declared in 1389 that after 5 years of palace service, a consort could retire and live a normal life, which might include marriage and starting a family. Some chose spiritual life instead, becoming nuns, while others remained working within palace institutions such as the imperial laundry. Among the most unusual and historically significant cases is that of consort Wenxiu, the concubine of China's last emperor Puyi. Following the emperor's expulsion from the Forbidden City in 1924, she lived with him and his wife in Tianjin, but in 1931, she made an extraordinary decision. She demanded a divorce, an act no concubine had ever dared to attempt. Puyi, though dethroned, issued a formal edict demoting her to commoner status. She returned to Beijing, quietly lived the rest of her life as a primary school teacher, and died of illness in 1950, never remarrying. Her story marks the symbolic end of a centuries-old system, and though hers was only one voice, it echoed with the strength of thousands who never got the chance to speak.